Hey everyone, it's Miriam with a Y from Miriam's Nature. When I want to know something, I can be stubborn and a little obsessive. Well, I've been obsessed with figuring out how to make consistent dendrite fractals in acrylic paint that dry well. The known way of making them is to get acrylic ink, pour out some thinned white paint onto a surface, and add a drop of the ink to that white paint, and then add a drop of alcohol on top of the ink. And you'll get a fractal. Yeah, that works every time. But what bummed me out about doing it this way was that you really had to be ever so careful where the drop of alcohol fell so that you got a well-centered drop, and how much alcohol you dropped. And then most of them ended up looking alike. And you were limited in size, so if you wanted to make really tiny fractals, that would really be a challenge. And I kind of wanted to be able to do all those things, have different looking ones, have different sized ones, and not have to be so worried about where I dropped the alcohol. So I went about trying every liquid in my house, short of apple juice and milk. If it had any chemical or non-organic sounding ingredient in it, I tried it. The fact that my house is still standing is kind of a miracle, because I am sure that along the way I probably combined some things that had no business being in the same cup. Now, I found something else that works for sure, but since it may not be available to everyone, I want to show you how to do it with the expected materials first: ink and alcohol on thinned down acrylic paint. We'll play with the mystery liquid in a bit. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is spread out my white paint. I've poured some onto a tile and I'm going to spread it out. And I'm using my pick, and I know some of you tease me about the pick, but the reason I use the pick instead of a palette knife or a cake spreader is because the pick just does a better job at getting the paint spread level. So, I mean, no matter how hard I work with a palette knife, there's always going to be an uneven area. But the teeth of the pick distribute the paint beautifully. And for the fractals, it really makes a difference, because if you've got like a little sort of like waviness to your paint, well, your fractal will get all wonky. So if you want them to be nice and round, you want evenly spread paint. So now, instead of putting the drop of acrylic ink on the white paint, I'm going to put it in the palette instead. Now, instead of adding the alcohol here, obviously, since the ink is here, I'm going to put the alcohol here. And I usually put about twice the amount of alcohol to the amount of ink. I'm going to mix this nicely. And I'm just using a ball stylus. You can use a toothpick, a bamboo skewer, doesn't matter. And now I've got a drop of it on the end of my stylus, and I'm just going to let it sit there. And it's really tiny right now, but there is a fractal forming. And so what I'm going to do now is just keep feeding it. So as I add more alcohol to it, it'll spread more. Now, in theory, I could do this forever and ever, but I'm going to not do that. And what's nice about doing it this way is you can have them different sizes. Because let's say you wanted a really tiny fractal for some reason or another, you would be really hard-pressed to get a drop of alcohol small enough on top of a little drop of the ink there. But this way, you can decide how big you want them to be. And then you can also kind of get a little creative with it. now, what if you don't have acrylic ink? Well, if you've got fluid acrylic, that'll work too. Now, this would never have worked where you put a drop on the white paint and then add alcohol. And the reason it would never have worked before is because this is thicker than the ink and it's too heavy for the alcohol to push. What's really making the fractal is alcohol. If you ever looked at just alcohol on the white paint, which I did because I was obsessed, just alcohol alone is enough to make a fractal. It's just that you can't see it because it's clear. So all we're doing is coloring the alcohol. So, but whatever the alcohol is going to push against needs to be light enough for the alcohol to be able to move it. So if it's too thick, like this would be, then add the alcohol to it first, and then it'll work also. So, and like before, I'm going to feed it. Now, if you don't have this brand works just as well. This is DecoArt's version. It's less expensive than Golden's version, but it's also a fluid acrylic and it works just as well. So you just need to add alcohol to it, like I did in this well here. Okay, now what if you don't have either the ink or the fluid acrylic? Well, if you've got Bombay ink, the India ink, that'll work too, and that's what's here. And I've mixed in some alcohol, and again, all these things are doing is coloring the alcohol. It's the alcohol that's making the fractal. And each thing that you add makes the fractal a little bit differently. And then I can just have fun feeding them. And then you can mix and match. You can add this to that one. Let's give him a little blue in there. Now the other thing I've noticed too is as paint dries, it forms a thin film on the top layer. And so if I don't work quickly enough, if this paint starts to form that film, the dendrites are going to have a harder time forming. So periodically, if you're going to be doing this on a wide area, you want to break up the film that might have been forming on the top so that you still have fresh paint to do this on. And if you're thinking you might want a lighter version of any of your colors, well, then I add white fluid acrylic to whatever color I've already mixed, and that will let me change the color. And then if you add that, then you need to add a little bit more alcohol too. And let's mix that up. And then let's add it here. So now we've got a different blue or teal. Something else to note when you're making these, if you don't want what's happening here to happen, if you want them to be all nice and round and not sort of distorted by anything else, make sure that the ones that you add nearby are far enough apart. Because this one I made before making these guys. And so when I started to make this one, once it hits the wall of this one, it can't push against it. It won't. It'll stop. And so that's why it's kind of crunched up right here. And the same thing happened just here. So keep that in mind. This could be a fun look. You might choose to do this, but just in case. The way to avoid it is to space them apart. Now, if you're wondering, well, if all this is doing is coloring the alcohol, can't I just use regular acrylic paint? Yes and no. If you mix a little bit of acrylic paint with water first, you want to thin down the acrylic, you can, but because you're adding water, water is taking down the effect. And I'll show you a little bit of that. Okay, so I'm taking my favorite blue, my Artist Loft blue, and I squeezed out a little dollop of that paint. So this is, I guess, medium body paint, and I'm going to add it there. And I'll add some water to it. And you really need to add the water first, because if you add the alcohol first, it just doesn't mix. I sat there forever and all I was getting was little clumps that I couldn't break up. And so adding the water first really seemed to be the key. Let's add some alcohol. And I need to add a little more to counteract the fact that there's so much water. And let's see how this works. Sometimes it works nicely, sometimes not so much. Yeah, it's kind of fuzzy. You know, they're not as good, if you will. But let's try feeding it and see if that helps. It's growing a little bit, but I don't know. It's not how I'd like it to be. So these just, you know, they just don't turn out as well. And they sometimes go fuzzy and don't dry as nicely. Here I'm just going to show you some that have dried before and how well they maintained. I mean, and sometimes you get really pale ones. See how the little dendrites there are so pale, but so pretty and so delicate. Look at this guy. I love that guy. How pretty that one is. But if you look at this one's really different. And why? And so is this one. Very different. And these guys are pretty different too. So now let me show you what causes these to happen. The weird liquid that blew my mind and worked really nicely was my stamp cleaner. And the stamp cleaner, the main ingredient of it is 1-methoxy-2-propanol. 99.5% of this is that. And what's interesting about that is that I Googled that, and it's the same thing as propylene glycol methyl ester, which is the same thing that's in alcohol ink. So I thought, well, then alcohol ink should work. Alcohol ink doesn't work at all. And my only guess for that is the binder in alcohol ink, whatever makes alcohol ink shiny and stick to your surface, is somehow impeding the ability of the alcohol to do its thing. I flipped the tile around to show you something because I played with it off camera for a second. What I did here and there was add some of the acrylic, just straight blue acrylic, and then I added that to the middle, and that was kind of pretty. And it fed the other, like, little tributaries, if you will. I mean, I love this. It's seriously like snowflakes. Each one of them is going to be a different experience. I think this would be so fun to do with kids. And I'm sure there's some serious chemistry reason for this. And if any of you out there know why this works, I would love to know. And for the last step, let's try this. So this comes with a sort of a dauber top. But if you squeeze on the bottle, a drop will come out. So I'm going to squeeze out. And I'm going to add our original Liquitex acrylic ink there. Mix it up well. And spreading some more white paint to play on. And then with my ball stylus again, I'm going to pick up a drop of this mix and dunk it in. And this, I've always noticed, works really nicely, but really slowly. Like it's not as quick as straight alcohol. And while that one's forming, I'll put another one out there. And maybe one up here. And I'm going to let those sit for a minute or two, and then we'll be back. So it's been about 2 minutes, and let me zoom you in. They're less structured, I guess, in a way, in that the branches are all different lengths, and it doesn't seem to try to be round, but it's always pretty, so I'm okay with that. And you can mix and match that stuff too with, this was the straight the alcohol from before. And let's see, what if I add some of the straight acrylic? Let's see what happens to that. Yeah, it colors it and then feeds it. Zoom in. So that's fun. But another thing that's different with the straight stamp cleaner, it only seems to be happy with the Liquitex ink. It doesn't like the Bombay ink, the India ink. It doesn't like the fluid acrylic. It only seems to like the acrylic ink. But if I add alcohol now to it also, it's going to give me a different look again. More in line with what the alcohol by itself did. And once I've done that, now I can add other things to this if I want. So if I want to add a drop of Bombay into this now to change up the color, I can. And now we'll get a richer, deeper purple. And also now it's made it more structured. Like, see, notice how now it's rounder than it was before. And after another minute, it's grown more. So now this is the stamp cleaner with the alcohol, with Bombay ink, and the acrylic ink, all those mixed. So there are just so many different combinations to try and colors to mix, and you can just play. And you may come up with a new mix that works too. And if you do and you're willing to share, definitely let us know in the comments. And I hope you had fun watching this, and I hope you give this a try. And if you enjoyed this, let me know with a thumbs up, and definitely share with your friends and groups. Let me know if you think you'll try this. Now, the exact stamp cleaner I used can only be found at Michael's stores and michaels.com. But since the compound that makes up 99% of it is primarily a solvent that's made just as an ink solvent, I'm hoping other stamp cleaners use it too. And if some of you have other brands of stamp cleaners in the house, could you give it a try? And if it works, let us know in the comments. If you're new to the channel, remember to subscribe. And lastly, I want to say a special thank you to these wonderful people that have kindly contributed to the channel to help keep it going. If you'd like to contribute too, there's a link in the description box below. Another way that you can help the channel is by clicking on one of the Amazon links if you're going to do some shopping on Amazon. If you're looking for fluid art supplies for acrylics, resin, or alcohol inks, I've set up this page on Amazon for you. A list of the products I know and trust from various Amazon vendors. I hope you had fun watching this. It was fun filming it. Thank you so much for your continued support, and I appreciate you watching. Now go let your creative nature shine. Play with some ink, play with some paint. See you next time. Bye now.